The subway is a good barometer for the type of random disorder that can quickly escalate into violence. To go from having 1 or 2 homicides a year on the subways to going to have 31 homicides since the spring of 2020 is just an enormous change.
This is Manhattan Insights, a Manhattan Institute production. I'm your host, Reihan Salam. 2 years ago, New Yorkers elected Eric Adams as their mayor. At a time when crime and disorder were top concerns for voters, he triumphed with a law and order campaign, promising to restore the city's safety and economic vitality. So how has America's biggest city fared in the Adams era? What have we learned about the challenges facing the 5 boroughs? And what have we learned about the man charged with navigating Gotham through a migrant crisis, a persistent housing affordability crisis, and a looming fiscal crisis that could force deep cuts in city services? My guest today has reported on all things New York City for years. Nicole Gelinas is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, a contributing editor of City Journal, and a columnist at the New York Post. She's also one of the most incisive thinkers about public finance in the nation, an ace reporter, and just a wonderful, wonderful colleague. She joins us today to discuss Adams' track record and political prospects and some of the biggest issues facing the city. Nicole, thanks for joining the show.
Good afternoon, Ryan. Thanks for having me on.
So Eric Adams is someone who had been a state senator. He was a police officer. He was a gadfly for a very long time. And he served, his most recent office, his most senior political office, was serving as Brooklyn borough president. How did that prepare him for taking on what is arguably one of the most complex, difficult challenges when it comes to municipal governance in the country, maybe even the world?
Well, I think you identify the challenge that we face right now in your question, in that Eric Adams was elected 2 years ago because he was the only candidate who identified rising violent crime and disorder as the number one issue that New Yorkers were beginning to be worried about, particularly after the dislocations of the pandemic, on top of state-level changes to the criminal justice system that had happened and taken effect in 2019. People voted on the increase in shoplifting, that everything was locked up in the drugstores, on the increase in their own feeling of perception of not being safe walking to and from work. And that was all backed up by the statistics. We had the biggest single increase in the level of homicides, 52% across 1 year. That was the biggest increase in the shortest period of time that New York had ever experienced. So that partly came from Adams's background, as you said, as a police captain and as a middle-class outer borough individual attuned to what people were thinking about. But the flip side of that is, yes, he had the background to identify what people were worried about, but he didn't bring the management experience necessary to execute his vision. So he never ran a large organization that was accountable for real concrete results.
For those listeners who don't know, tell us about the Office of Borough President.
Right. Well, that's the problem. Borough President it's an office with no responsibilities. This is an office that used to have responsibilities up until the 1980s reforms of New York City government, but since then it is an entirely ceremonial post. The job is to sort of use the bully pulpit just to get attention for your constituents. You can propose legislation in City Council, but has no actual responsibilities of getting things done. So you can easily fall into a habit, and as borough president, of just every day it's a different press conference, you're highlighting a different issue, and then you just move on to the next issue. No one holds you accountable for what you proposed at that press conference. Before that, state senator, also, not a position where you are individually accountable for results. So you get to the mayoralty. It's okay if a mayor hasn't had significant management experience, but that person has to appoint a number two person, deputy mayor, first deputy mayor for operations, who has had that significant management experience, and the mayor has not done that, and we've seen the results of that over the past 2 years. Good vision, but so far poor execution.
One argument you could make about Adams is that he's kind of been the borough president of the city of New York. He's someone who loves the nightlife. He's a great cheerleader for the city in a way. And when he was first elected, there was a lot of enthusiasm about the idea of a black, moderate, who represents a different strain, a different tendency in national democratic politics. There were even people saying that he could have a national political future. So tell us a bit about that. Eric Adams' role as cheerleader-in-chief for the city versus some of those other considerations you mentioned.
Right, and I think there is a role to be cheerleader-in-chief. I mean, Ed Koch did this. Even to some extent, Giuliani and Bloomberg did this. The one criticism of Mayor de Blasio was he wasn't a very good cheerleader-in-chief. He didn't seem to enjoy doing classic New York City things, whatever is your New York City thing, whether it's seeing a baseball or a basketball game or going to the opera or going to the museum. De Blasio wasn't interested in that. I mean, as he said himself, he was happy to sit at home and watch Netflix. And so Adams is a change and wanting to enjoy the things that make New York, New York. I don't think anyone minds if he wants to go out to nightclubs and go out to fancy dinners every night, but that should not be what you are exclusively doing. And he risks that becomes the only thing that he's identified with as being the sort of flamboyant cheerleader for the city.
One thing that's been said of Adams, in contrast with his predecessor, is that while Bill de Blasio was someone who is ideological. He was ideological in his bones. This is a guy who was raising money for the Sandinistas. He was someone who, thinks in those ideological terms. That Eric Adams was he is fundamentally someone who is transactional. And that in a way, to be transactional is from the perspective of large employers, from the perspective of the interest groups that depend on the city thriving and running. From their perspective, fair enough. He wants something for Central Brooklyn, for Southeastern Queens. He wants something for his constituents. He wants something for public employees who voted for him. The Hotel Workers Union. Fair enough. But I guess one argument is that Bill de Blasio was mayor of New York on easy mode at a time when the national economy was pretty robust overall, when revenues were surging, when New York City, and particularly its kind of midtown central business district, was in really robust shape, and that Eric Adams, even if you see him as an improvement in some important respects, suddenly the city has gone from easy mode to hard mode. I wonder if that makes sense to you, if that resonates with you.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, de Blasio, until his last 2 years when COVID hit, the city was in the best position that it had been in really since the mid-1960s. And de Blasio's big failing...
And was that entirely his doing? Was that because of his wise public policy?
No, he inherited a good situation from his predecessor, Bloomberg. And to his credit, he didn't make things significantly worse until his final 2 years. He appointed Bratton as police commissioner. He pretty much deferred to Bratton on a lot of issues. They kept a lid on crime up until the last couple of years of his term. I think Adams...
So in some ways it was more rhetoric when it came to criminal justice than it was practice, at least for the beginning of his tenure.
Right. With de Blasio and the ideology, if you had de Blasio, for example, putting migrants in the Roosevelt Hotel smack in the middle of Midtown, you would know, and de Blasio would tell you, it's entirely ideology, that he wants people who are coming to this country and looking for economic opportunity and looking for asylum to be living side by side with some of the richest commuters in the world. It would be an entirely ideological issue with de Blasio, but with Adams, it's transactional. He's done a deal with the Pakistani government, which owns the Roosevelt Hotel. We don't know the details of the deal, and it's a failure to manage the crisis. But you get the same result, whether it's from ideology or the transactionalism and the failure to manage.
Is your sense that Adams would have been elected if we didn't have the COVID crisis? Do you think that it was really that unique confluence of circumstances? Would the city have gone further left, let's say, if it had been humming along as it was in 2019?
Yes, de Blasio was elected because people were pleased with how things were going. If you look at your pyramid of needs, of course, New York always has issues, both real and boutique issues. But when de Blasio was elected, the crime was then at a record low. The economy, number of jobs was at a record high. You could feel like you could take a moment and sit back and think, de Blasio ran on the Tale of Two Cities theme, so people could actually sit back and think, is the city providing for everything that everybody needs? And
you could almost indulge these kind of progressive notions. Why not? We can afford it.
And he was the person who embodied that. Now that we've covered the basics, we can start to go beyond the basics. And Adams was more of a back to basics election where people didn't feel like they had the luxury to think about inequality anymore, or to think about, can we add a new program like pre-K for 3 and 4-year-olds? Perfectly fine program. When we now have to think about, again, how do we go back to reducing the murder rate to where it was 3 years ago? So Adams was more of, at least the way he ran, more of a Giuliani or a Bloomberg or an Ed Koch candidate. We need to get back to these basics before we can think about the luxuries.
Okay, so that was the kind of thematic, idea. This was the thesis. I'm going to get us back to basics. But in practice, boy, oh boy, a lot of things unfolded. One of them, you mentioned before, that de Blasio had these, this last year and a half that was pretty chaotic, pretty challenging. But also, that's when a huge amount of COVID relief hit the city, right? And Mayor de Blasio still held the reins and was still in a position to shape the city's budget, including setting some recurring expenditures. So I wonder if you could talk to us about that, because I guess one view is that for many American cities and states, this was manna from heaven. This was an opportunity to really think long term. How is it we apply this kind of influx of resources? How did New York City handle this huge influx of resources in the thick of the COVID crisis? And what implications has that had for the Adams mayoralty?
Right. If you think about how federal aid was structured in 2020, 2021, we really didn't need the direct aid to states and cities because the federal government, both under Trump and Biden, pretty much held everybody harmless for the income or the jobs that they lost during the pandemic. So if you filed federal taxes and you made under $60,000 a year and you lost income or your job, federal government entirely made up for that, even did that for undocumented immigrants, which they had never done.
Therefore, you could pay sales taxes and income taxes and what have you.
Wealthier people who didn't, for the most part, lose their income or jobs, they couldn't do international travel, so they renovated their houses. They brought major purchases forward. They sales taxes, buying cars, buying refrigerators, all kinds of big ticket items. So sales taxes actually kept up. Income taxes kept up. Property taxes, with the exception of the commercial real estate issue in New York City and other major cities, kept up. So the city and the state, and this is true for most of the country, did not suffer a tax revenue shortfall. So the federal government could have bailed out the city just indirectly through bailing out the people and businesses that pay taxes to the city, but instead they not only bailed out the people and bailed out the businesses, but also bailed out the governments themselves. So what happened is state and city had massive surplus of tens of billions of dollars of revenue coming in from the federal government. The state, to its credit, actually saved a lot of that money and put together, an $8-10 billion reserve reserve that it's only starting to draw down on. But the city did not. Under de Blasio, we use that money to increase education spending, use that money to increase all kinds of COVID relief that programs that have become essentially permanent.
And what you're saying is that money wasn't all use it or lose it. That was money that could, in principle, have been used for long-term capital projects or for savings and what have you.
Yeah, I mean, there were some restrictions in COVID relief, but they could have put some of this money, more of this money, into reserve so that we would have it when these longer-term effects of COVID, including the property tax decline, we may need that money 3 and 4 years down the road. And instead, we are looking, as the state controller says, at $9 to $11 billion budget deficits next year, which on a local tax base, when you're thinking about the part of the city budget that's not paid by state and federal subsidies, $80 billion or so. So this is an enormous deficit that we're looking at starting next year.
It's incredible.
Easily goes through our limited reserves very, very quickly.
And my understanding is that Mayor Adams, he made some pretty significant wage and benefit concessions to city workers in the recent round of contract renegotiations. So is your view that this was something that was strictly necessary in order to preserve the workforce for the city? Because, unemployment has lagged national unemployment, but it's still a relatively tight labor market here in New York City. So is that your view, that he didn't have much of a choice, or do you think that he could have driven a harder bargain?
He could have gotten some concessions from the workforce on productivity in return for the labor deals that he did. The issue is not the raises. If the Biden administration gets, and the Federal Reserve gets inflation back down to closer to 2% in the next few years, the raises will pretty much come out even. They'll be lower than inflation for the first couple of years, but higher than inflation for the last couple of years of the union contract. So it's not that he gave, blowout 8% a year raises to the uniformed workforce in particular. It's just that he didn't get any concessions in return for those wage increases. And he could have held out. You can have union contracts that are expired for a while. There's no need to rush and get all of these union contracts agreed to in the first 18 months of his administration.
Mayor Adams came into office pledging to do something about crime and disorder. One of his first advertisements, if not his first, was actually talking about graffiti, which was really striking. It felt like a big throwback to another time. Certainly there are some folks on the left who ridiculed him over this. But as you say, it was something that seemed to resonate with people. When you look at that narrow, specific aspect of his mandate, how has he done? How has he fared? Is your sense that actually he has done a lot to get crime and disorder under control in the city?
I think there is an element of good news where he focused much on the level of homicides and shootings, gang-related shootings, pushing up homicides in 10 or 12 hotspot neighborhoods, which Ralph has written about significantly. And that has worked. The homicide rate has come down, even though it's still, 12 to 15% to get whatever week it is higher than it was back in 2019. But that has consumed, and that's good, but that has consumed all of our policing resources. So he doesn't have much left over to focus on some of the lower level disorder that people are still concerned about. Shoplifting still up by significant double-digit percentages compared to 2019. Most other felony crime, total felonies are about a third higher than they were in 2019. Auto thefts, grand larceny, robberies, assaults. All these things have gone in the wrong direction, and he hasn't made any decisive progress on those things. And so that's where you get into a longer-term management decision. Do we need to increase the size of the police force? Because it's flirting with 3-decade lows. We've gone from 40,000 people down to, closer to 34,000 uniformed officers. Does he need to make a push like Mayor Dinkins did before him, like Mayor Giuliani did, to increase the size of the police force? And if so, how do you sell that to the council, and where do you get the money for it? And he's never addressed that issue. He just seems to want to bump along at this low level of police officers, and this is the result we get, that he, unless things change, he won't be able to run on bringing crime back down to 2019 levels.
Mayor Adams appointed Keechan Sewell to be his police commissioner. She was a somewhat unconventional choice. And then she resigned not all that long ago, a few months ago. She is someone who seems to have actually won the respect of the department, of a lot of folks who were skeptical about her, having come from Nassau County, having come from a much smaller jurisdiction. So I'm curious if you have any insight into what exactly is going on with this recruiting and retention crisis. It does seem as though you're seeing that in many cities. And of course, trained NYPD officers are awfully attractive to suburban jurisdictions around the country. So there's a tight labor market for police officers too. But is there something from a management perspective that the mayor and his team are getting wrong? Is the NYPD demoralized? What's going on there?
Yeah, I think that is Adams's big problem, is that he wouldn't let the commissioner do her job. So he picked someone who was a good candidate. It's good to have someone with both law enforcement experience, but who is an outsider to the department. I mean, when Bratton originally came in, he was also an outsider. Someone who can bring some, for example, in an age where we want better self-discipline of the police department, someone who could bring an outsider's eye on disciplinary procedures and so forth. And she won the respect of the officers. She was doing good work. But Adams has a small cadre of top people whom he trusts, including Phil Banks, and it basically puts these people in charge of the commissioners and micromanages them and overrides their decisions. And, even on very specific disciplinary actions against top uniformed people in the police department, overriding the commissioner's decisions on those issues. And she felt like she couldn't do her job under these conditions. So, if you have 2 or 3 people in the mayor's office who are going around the commissioner and interfering with the department, I think it's hard to attract and recruit good people under those conditions.
It also does seem as though there are other talented, conscientious, hardworking folks who are looking to the exits right now in the Adams administration. So you've talked about this circle that's been around the mayor for some time. They've been with him since he was borough president, in some cases even before that. He has some very close friends, close political allies, folks who've helped him over the course of his political rise, helped him with his fundraising. It does seem as though he's encountering some challenges, and that there are folks in the Adams orbit who are facing accusations of political corruption. I wonder if you could talk to us about that. This is something that in New York City political circles has always kind of hovered around the edges, the idea that he's associated himself with people who are not always the most savory characters. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about that.
Right. I think the mayor's, first of all, on the policy side, it's okay to bring your longtime loyalists into the administration and reward them. I mean, this is how the real world works. But it's not okay to have those people persist and continue to override the decisions of, okay, these people helped you win, but once you won, you need real top policy people. You have to be able to keep your political loyalist people from interfering with the top policy people, if that makes sense. And he seems unable to do that. And on the campaign side, I think it's another example of his inability to focus and manage, with this scandal breaking of his top campaign fundraiser, having her home raided by the FBI. Not quite allegations yet because there's no criminal complaint, but suspicions. And again, they're only suspicions of straw donor foreign nationals who are not allowed to give money to local campaigns, potentially donating fraudulently to the Adams campaign in large sums because they want something in return. So pretty serious suspicions. But again, Adams hired a 25-year-old person with no experience doing this to be his top campaign fundraiser. So was that a wise management decision? At best, likely not, and at worst, it could go well beyond that. So, and and again, this week he was telling the press, well, I always tell my people to follow the law. Well, that may be true, but if you have created an environment where they can't do what you are asking them to do within the law, telling them to follow the law is not going to get the results that you want.
It's foolish to speculate about this, but also I suppose you could say when you have a very close-knit circle that distrusts outsiders, you could even have some instances where it's not necessarily malfeasance or corruption, but amateurishness or wanting to cover up mistakes, and that's something that can get you into trouble too.
Right, and this is why you want to have someone who has run major campaigns before, overseeing your fundraising. Not to say you don't want to hire ambitious young people and keep an eye on them, but you want experienced people as well, like the campaign of Andrew Yang. One of Adams's competitors in 2021 said they had two people checking all donations for, does this look suspicious? And that would seem to be a normal practice. This is not a campaign for city council or a borough president where you're raising much lower amounts of money. You really don't have any favors to give out, and the level of scrutiny on you is not going to be as high. Where in those instances, not that you want to engage in wrongdoing, but if someone comes to you later and says, this guy donated whatever and he shouldn't have, you can give the money back. At this level and the coordination of these donations, it seems like something that should have been caught.
Let's stipulate that Eric Adams isn't perfect. I'm sure he would happily acknowledge that. But when you're looking at this moment, if you're looking at 2023 from the vantage point of 2021, one big shock that's emerged is the massive influx of migrants, not just from Central America and South America, but also from outside the Western Hemisphere entirely. The city has taken on over 100,000 newcomers, and these are not folks coming through regular channels. These are not even folks who are unauthorized and then, basically becoming integrated into ethnic and family networks, finding employment in the underground economy, as you've seen for decades in New York City. You're seeing something that's very new that has precipitated what has been rightly called a crisis. Talk to us a little bit about the migrant crisis and how this has kind of interacted with some of Mayor Adams' management qualities.
Right. So, yes, it is absolutely true that the root of the migrant crisis goes to the Biden administration's failure to impose some kind of discipline at the southern border. Millions of people have gotten the message that if you're able to cross the southern border, you will be in the United States for an indefinite time period, whether you've applied for asylum, although most people have not even applied for asylum and gotten to that point in the process. So fine, Biden has failed to manage the border, but the issue for New York City is that the failure to manage the border is combined with the city's insistence that it has a right to shelter obligation, that anybody can come and present themselves to city governments and get indefinite shelter, although that has changed a little bit, on demand. And Adams
unconditional. You could show up right now on demand shelter and you'd get it.
Right. So you show up to the Roosevelt Hotel, present yourself as a migrant or asylum seeker, and be put into a hotel room or another guaranteed shelter. So that is what has driven the migrant numbers to New York City and is driving the fiscal side of the crisis in New York City, that we're having to spend $3 billion on renting hotel rooms around the city, building tent shelters, and in many cases taking them down, all under inefficient, no-bid, non-competitive emergency contracts. Now, Adams has questioned some aspects of the right to shelter. He's put 30 to 60-day time limits where you have to reapply for the right to shelter, but he hasn't gotten to the issue in New York. Is there really a right to shelter in New York City or not? It's not in the state constitution. Koch administration agreed there was a right 40 years ago, but Adams has not made a motion in court to open that up, have the state's highest court rule, is there a right to shelter or not?
What is the thought process here? So there are a number of different theories I've heard, one of which is that if New York City did not have its unconditional unlimited right to shelter, then that would mean that we would see encampments on the streets, as you do in many West Coast cities, as you do in much of the Ninth Circuit. Another view is that, look, when you have an unlimited, unconditional right to shelter, what it means is that homelessness service providers, who, by the way, are, I'm sure, great people, but what it means is that they're not subject to fiscal trade-offs, and essentially you've created an entitlement, which is awfully hard for them to want to give up, and that the mayor is reluctant to, basically take on that constituency. What do you think is driving the decision here?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of things. The traditional homeless advocates, as Steve and I might say, they don't want to give up the right to shelter because that would open a host of problems for them as well. Should single adult men also have a 60-day time limit on their stays? If you question the very right to shelter itself, then that would bring up those questions on the traditional homeless population of single adult men as well as homeless families. So it's a very uneasy truce right now with the traditional homeless shelter advocates and people continuing to advocate for open borders in New York City, as most of the city's elected progressive class is still doing. I mean, people such as Brad Lander, elected city controller, he's not questioning either open borders or the right to shelter. He's just saying Biden administration should be paying for all this.
I wonder about the interaction between the right to shelter and the fact that you have this enormous unregulated inflow. Now, there are many cities in the United States, right? And if you're looking at the unauthorized population overall, there are a ton of unauthorized immigrants in, Atlanta or Miami or Dallas or wherever else. And of course, one element of this crisis is that the border states were absorbing a huge amount of this inflow. So it seems that the right to shelter is something that makes New York City pretty unique. New York City is going to be attractive to low-income immigrants because you don't need to own a car. It's a place that does have, even now, a wealth of job opportunities, including low-wage job opportunities. But then you also have this right to shelter. But I'm curious, what's happening with other cities and other jurisdictions, and what can we learn from them about how to handle this?
Yeah, I mean, certainly we are not the only city dealing with a migrant issue. Chicago also erecting city-run tents, which have upset many residents of adjoining neighborhoods. Massachusetts has a different type of right to shelter in that it's not something that a mid-level judge interpreted. The state legislature did create a right to shelter in Massachusetts, but different in that it is a state obligation and the state moves people into areas where there is some shelter available rather than have everybody focused in one city. And that's been a big strain in Massachusetts as well, in California as well. You have the tent city issue in major cities in California. But the fiscal issue for New York is the right to shelter and putting people in hotel shelters that are costing, close to $400 per night in the shelter has been an enormous both magnet and fiscal issue for the city.
Despite New York City's various economic and fiscal challenges, it's actually quite remarkable that the city has sustained this as much as it has. My understanding is that if you're looking at planned expenditures for the migrant population, we're looking at something on the order of $5 billion, which is pretty comparable to the amount that New York City spends on the NYPD. Does that sound right?
Yeah, between last fiscal year and this fiscal year, because this kind of all started at the tail end of fiscal year 2022, late spring of calendar year 2022. So over that 18 months or so, we'll spend about $5 billion, and then we'll spend another $4 billion next fiscal year, and another $4 billion the fiscal year after that. So that is, you might say on a budget that's inching toward $120 billion, $4 to $5 billion a year doesn't seem like a lot. But the issue is, as with all local budgets, a lot of the local budget is programmatic flow-through from the state and federal government. So things like Medicaid, you can't really repurpose Medicaid dollars to migrants. And just like in household budgets, a lot of the income is allocated to things you can't easily change. Pensions for retirees and future retirees, healthcare benefits for retirees, debt service payments. Those three things together get you close to a third of the city budget. So it's not easy to say, yes, we can just find $4 to $5 billion in savings. That will cut into basic services.
So I'm curious, when you're looking at that city-funded portion of the budget, and then you're looking at the number you noted earlier on from the comptroller of the state of New York, that the city could be looking at something in the range of a $10 to $14 billion budget gap. Talk to us about how practicable that is. Mayor Adams, to his credit, has been talking about belt tightening. He has, for example, said, hey, look, there are open roles in city government. We're not going to fill those roles. He does seem to, in relative terms at least, been advancing a message of fiscal abstemiousness. But when you're talking about 5, 10, 15% cuts, that seems pretty challenging.
Right. We haven't had an actual cut to the city budget since 2008, and it was a tiny cut. It was around 3% of the city budget just in that 1 year, and then it started to increase again. So you'd have to go back to the fiscal crisis of the 1970s before you would think about proposed budget cuts of this magnitude. When you think about a 5% actual cut to the budget for 3 years in a row, even with good management and good labor agreements and a labor force that's willing to make concessions, would be very, very difficult to do that without the public seeing this impact on services. Now, the education budget, for example, with school enrollment down, are there places
down like 10%, so down
right,
quite substantially.
Yeah. Are there places to find savings in a close to $40 billion education budget? Yes, that would be a good assumption. But you have advocates saying, you can't cut a dime from the education budget even though enrollment is down. So
or even saying you can't cut a dime from individual school budgets that have experienced even steeper
right,
decreases in enrollment.
Right. And then you have this new class size mandate that was imposed by the state legislature and the governor last year, which makes it even harder to impose education cuts.
So when you talk about things that one could in principle do, you could in principle do things like try to exact productivity concessions from city workers. But in a way, that train has left the station. Those were things that one could have done. So basically what you're telling me is that, the mayor was elected in 2021, was inaugurated in 2022, and has had some time. But basically, those decisions are all in the rear view, so it's almost baked in that we're going to have this really painful fiscal crunch.
Right, and tax revenues are still coming in higher than expected at the city level. I mean, sales tax revenues are doing well. But we also have the longer-term issue, which was talked about at a recent Citizens Budget Commission conference, and E.J. McMahon of the Empire Center, you've been saying for years now, the top 0.1% of the income tax base is being eroded. It was happening before COVID. Former Governor Cuomo raised the top marginal income tax rate a couple of years ago to close to 11%.
At a time when actually the budget was in pretty healthy shape.
Right.
Yeah.
And the pandemic accelerated high income taxpayers leaving the state. Some of them may have left anyway, but they left, 5 to 10 years before they might have. They're not being replaced by newer people. So that is also an issue. Are we losing tiny slice of the tax base that is responsible for, 40% of city income taxes?
I'm curious. You made a really interesting and subtle point about the interaction between the migrant inflow and some of the quality of life challenges the city has experienced. So, as we said, Eric Adams, among the kind of city's elite political class, is someone who really does seem to have taken those back to basics issues seriously, talking not just about graffiti, but about all sorts of public disorder. And yet, this is anecdotal, but it sure seems as though when you're walking around public spaces in New York City, even in Midtown, where we are right now, the stench of cannabis smoke is pretty pervasive. You see all manner of unregulated or lightly regulated or misregulated stores. It just seems, that there's a kind of sense of chaos in some corners of the city. And you've said that actually this is kind of a funny environment in which to try to bring newcomers in. Can you talk to us about that intersection?
Right. I mean, if you just arrived in a place and you don't speak the dominant language and you have no idea how you're supposed to behave in this place, you don't already have family members and friends here to say, don't do that. That's going to get you in trouble.
So, for example, don't jump the subway turnstile.
Right.
Yeah.
So you will just behave the way you see everybody else behaving. That's a normal thing. That's why you behave differently on Bourbon Street than you might behave in Bryant Park. Just judge very quickly how is everyone else behaving, and if you want to blend in, do what those people are doing. And so if you come to New York right now, for example, relatively minor thing, but not such a minor thing really, because it's one of the biggest complaints at community board meetings right now, riding mopeds and riding e-bikes that are going 20 miles an hour on the sidewalk and going the wrong way. I honestly think that a lot of newcomers don't even know that you're not supposed to ride your moped or ride your electric bike on the sidewalk because they've got those little curb cuts that are for wheelchair users, but it's pretty convenient for a bicycle. And if you see people in your business who are riding their mopeds on the e-bikes on the sidewalk or going the wrong way in the bike lane or blowing through the red light, why would you also not do that? People were not here 10 years ago or 5 years ago when these laws were enforced, albeit inconsistently. And if you are a newcomer and you see it's normal behavior to jump over the subway turnstile or walk in the wrong way, you're going to naturally do that too. So trying to absorb hundreds of thousands of newcomers at a time when we're not enforcing these visible issues of disorder just magnifies that disorder.
Nicole, this is a really profound observation you're making. So, here's a thought. So, at a time when you have a high degree of public safety, you have a high degree of esprit de corps when it comes to uniformed police officers. You just have this environment in which people can feel quite safe. And then you get this backlash. Then you say, we are too tight. We are over-policing communities. Let's relax it a bit. And then because these norms have emerged, they've grown entrenched, we're going to be okay. And actually people who say that we need to stringently enforce, we need to fix every broken window, we need to engage in this quality of life enforcement, they just don't get the fact that the natural state of the world is for people to be decorous and polite and use public spaces in a respectful way. What you're saying is that, we've pulled that back. we're now in this new equilibrium, and because of the natural churn of the city's population, there's a real danger that we're going to be stuck in this new equilibrium that represents a lot more disorder, a lot more of a perception of danger, if not real danger.
Right. I mean, if you look to when Bill Bratton, when he first came to New York in 1990, when he worked for when he ran the transit police starting in 1990. There were 250,000 people beating the fare every day. Some small but significant number of those people was also carrying illegal weapons, committing robberies in the transit system. And so Bratton said, along with George Kelly, who was kind of giving him the philosophical underpinnings of this, we have to stop people from beating the fare. And so he did that with a level of enforcement that if not a lot of people are beating the fare would be overkill. They would send police officers out there, and if you were beating the fare, you would be detained and put on a bus above ground while they checked if you had any warrants, which was a long process because there weren't computers. So you had a fax machine connected to the bus. And people got a misdemeanor ticket for beating the fare and would have to do community service. And the New York Times would come out and take pictures of these people doing community service. And so you could say, this is all a bit much if somebody just didn't have their MetroCard or at the time a token and ran through. But the point of this to make it so that if you were watching the news, you would see, these people got arrested just for beating the fare. I better not do that. And people learn very, very quickly, don't do this. And so it worked. So
it is fascinating.
Right. And so, by the time it's 2017 and you have record low crime on the subways and not a lot of people beating the fare, do you need to do that to that extent? Hopefully for most people, a civil violation and a fine will be sufficient. But do we need to go back to that level of crackdown today? Probably, but we're not quite doing it. I mean,
because the norm really has come undone. I'll just say, just as a casual observation, the number of people I see who are visibly, middle income people, people you wouldn't think of as being so desperate that they can't afford the fare and desperately need to get to a medical appointment or something like that. Someone, notionally sympathetic. It's just not that at all. You just see people brazenly fare beating almost as a kind of, antisocial act of defiance. And it's just demoralizing for others who might be people who, aren't terribly affluent, who see other people do this. It really is quite striking.
Right. Right.
Well, I wonder, Nicole, you have done a lot of work on public safety in the subway system. And the subway system is a place where so many different kinds of New Yorkers meet. You have all manner of quality of life challenges as well as public safety challenges. You have panhandling, including in some cases aggressive panhandling. You have unlicensed vendors. And it just seems like this incredible nexus where, I know you get a lot of people saying, Nicole, it's so silly of you to be concerned about unlicensed vendors or, this kind of thing. This is nonsense. But I wonder, why are you so concerned about it? And what are the trends we're seeing when it comes to quality of life, but also just basic safety on the subway?
Right. The subway is a good barometer for the type of random disorder that can quickly escalate into violence that people actually worried about in their day-to-day life. So to go from having 1 or 2 homicides a year on the subways from 1997 until 2019 to going to have 31 homicides in 3.5 years since the spring of 2020 is just an enormous change. So, we had 7 homicides in 2020, another 7 in 2021, 11 last year, and now we've had 6 this year. So yes, the progressive left say, that's not a lot of people. I mean, 31 people have died on the subway. Well, there's lots of people who die in all kinds of different ways. I mean, traffic deaths are many multiples of subway homicides.
An issue that you also care about very deeply.
Right, and that is certainly true. You are more likely to be killed in a traffic crash than to be killed on the subway. But we took a problem that we had fixed, and we unfixed it. So we have to go back to refixing that problem before we can address issues that we never got quite to that level of being fixed in the first place. And if we are having a multifold increase in subway homicides, and that is stemming from disorder that escalates into violence, which in most cases it is, that shows you that the level of disorder and violence above ground has escalated as well, and that is why people are more fearful in their day-to-day lives.
Nicole, there's been a geopolitical earthquake in the world. The war in Israel has really galvanized supporters of Israel, but I'm sorry to say it's also galvanized people who call for the destruction of Israel. And here in New York City, just literally a day after the Hamas atrocity in Israel, you had the Democratic Socialists of America sponsoring a rally in Times Square when they seemed to be just openly celebrating the violence against Jews, non-Jews, just innocent civilians in the south of Israel. I wonder, do you believe that this is going to have any political reverberations in the politics of New York City and New York State?
Well, I think to the extent that most local elections and state elections are very low turnout. Most voters probably don't even know what the DSA is, aren't familiar with DSA positions, may have had sympathy for progressive causes such as higher minimum wage, lower punishment for some low-level crimes. But to the extent that they haven't paid attention, haven't read the DSA's charter and actually known what does this group stand for and what do the politicians who have sought their endorsement stand for, this was a real eye-opener that the DSA promoted this rally that was celebrating the atrocities committed by Hamas just a day after those atrocities took place. If this is most people's introduction to the DSA, that's another place where if you haven't been paying attention, but you're starting to pay attention, you're kind of thinking, this is not what I signed up for. I may have some progressive sympathies, which moderate candidates and politicians can also channel, where some of these meet with what the moderate voter is thinking about as well. But, no, I did not sign up for celebrating a group that is celebrating Hamas, which is calling for the destruction of Israel.
Do you see moderates emerging on the political scene who, for example, outraged by this egregious anti-Semitism, Israel bashing, are there people there who could capitalize? Because, in a sense, Eric Adams, because of his unique biography, because of the fact that he's rooted in a really politically powerful, influential Black community that's rooted in public employment, these are homeowners with deep ties in the city. Is he sui generis, or are there other moderates out there who can kind of capitalize on this outrage?
I think where there's a voting base, a candidate will emerge. So he would be one of them. But I think it's true, it's not an if, that New York does have a deep, moderate voting base across all boroughs, including Manhattan, that are more and more disturbed by quality of life issues, disorder issues, violent crime issues, and, cost of living and housing and other issues. So that it creates an opportunity for future candidates who speak to those concerns. And we just had city council elections. Incumbents kept their seats. The Republicans gained, they remained even, but they did gain one city council seat in the Bronx. First time a Republican has won in the Bronx in 50 years. So that is something speaking to people's concerns in the Bronx. But the people will hopefully create the candidates and not the other way around.
I'm curious. Mayor Adams has a big challenge ahead of him. He's likely going to run for re-election in 2025. And despite the fact that there is some dissatisfaction, there's some ructions, there are some folks on his team who may or may not be under suspicion. It does seem pretty likely that he'll win re-election. So if you were to advise Mayor Adams about how to approach the enormous challenges to come, what would be your advice?
I think bring some new top people in and actually let them do the things that you brought them in for. It's not to say you can never say no to a commissioner. Of course that happens. I mean, Bloomberg said no to his commissioners on some occasions, but, go and ask outsiders for who would you bring into this position and, interview 3 outsider candidates and bring a few new people in, shake some things up. It can't hurt to get to have new people come in and to give them some autonomy and see what they come up with.
Nicole, thanks very much for joining me.
Thank you, Reihan.
Thank you for tuning in, and we hope you enjoyed the conversation. If you did like what you heard on the podcast, please consider giving us 5 stars and writing a review on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, or wherever you listen. And be sure to check out future episodes of Manhattan Insights.